Good afternoon, everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm John Eastwood, originally from Wellington, New Zealand, and now in Sydney, working for Sydney Local Health District. I'd like to welcome you here this afternoon, and gee, those lights are bright, to this last session of the day, Have We Forgotten Mental Health? It's a very important topic for myself, who, as I'm a social paediatrician, and a lot of the families I work with are quite traumatised by their ancestry and their backgrounds. I'd like to ask you all, if you may, to just raise your hand if you think, have we forgotten mental health? There's a few hands up. Okay, good. Right, so I'd like to first invite our first speaker, Professor Ron Rapee from Macquarie University. Ron's a distinguished professor in psychology at Macquarie University and is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. Professor Rapee specialises in mental health, especially in anxiety and related disorders across the lifespan. He's developed a number of empirically supported treatment programs that are used across the world, including Cool Kids program, and has been honoured by awards from both scientific and consumer groups. His recent work has focused on prevention of anxiety and depression, as well as on public dimension and access to empirically validated programs. Ron received the Distinguished Career Award from the Australian Association of Cognitive and Behavioural Therapy and the Distinguished Contribution to Science Award from the Australian Psychological Society. He is awarded a Member of the Order of Australia in 2012 for his contributions to clinical psychology, especially among young people. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks, John. I'm not going to be talking about young people particularly today, but I thought I'd start sort of back to front this time. I thought I'd try something different and start with the take-home message. And that way I figured if you want to go to sleep, given it's the end of the day, you can do so after this slide. I shouldn't turn around, should I? So basically what I want to talk about today is to give the message that emotional disorders play a central role in physical disease, not just an adjunctive role, but actually play a core process role in the presentation of physical diseases. So that's it. You can all go to sleep, and I'll go through my argument. I'll start out just a couple of facts and figures. So when I talk about emotional disorders, what I'm talking about primarily are anxiety and mood disorders. There's a whole range of other disorders we could include, but primarily the most frequent are anxiety and mood disorders, and those of course are often comorbid, so you tend to get patients presenting with at least features of both, if not meeting full criteria. Those anxiety and depression are the most prevalent mental disorders in society, and they also are responsible for the greatest burden of disease among mental disorders. So as a group, mental disorders are responsible for second or third amount of burden of disease of all diseases, so just pretty close to all cardiovascular diseases, all cancers, and mental disorders are right up there. And anxiety and depression account for the lion's share of the burden amongst mental disorders. So they're important disorders in their own right. They're important also because they tend to start early and last lifelong. So you tend to find anxiety disorders most commonly beginning in childhood or early adolescence, the average age of onset around 11. And mood disorders you tend to find with dramatic onset in the early to mid-adolescent years. And once people develop these disorders, you don't see a lot of waxing and waning in anxiety, and you find ups and downs in depression, but across the life course you tend to find recurrence of depression continuing. So they tend to be very chronic. Oh, well, that was fancy. And we're not only talking about the clinical disorders, but there's a lot of research showing that even at subclinical levels, anxiety and especially depression can have a very large impact on people's lives. So here's some data. This is from the national surveys of mental health. I put together here the child survey and the adult survey to give you an idea of the prevalence. So these are 12-month prevalence figures for anxiety and depression in the population in Australia. And you can see that anxiety starts off already around about 12% of the population of kids below age 12, and it tends to continue pretty consistently right across the lifespan until older age when it drops off. Mood disorders, of course, don't tend to begin early, but in adolescence they jump up and they're there from around about 8%, 6 to 8% right across the lifespan until older age, when both disorders tend to decrease a bit, which is always nice for those of us getting to that level. Now, having given you then, so keep that in mind. So that's the prevalence in the general population. So this is a study now, which is a large Spanish study done with, I think, about something like 20,000 patients or that sort of figure. So a very large survey in Spain of anxiety and depression in primary care. And so I'll give you the figures again for Australia to remind you of that, and then for the population, sorry, and then I'll show you also the primary care figures. And so here they are. And you can see that in primary care, anxiety and depression are much more common than they are in the general population, as you'd expect. And importantly for depression, there's around about 1 in 3 of your patients is going to meet criteria for a clinical diagnosis of a mood disorder of depression. Keep that in mind, because I'll come back to that later on. So let's have a look then at some of the other associations. So here's some data this is back from the Australian National Survey of Mental Health, looking at the overlap between these two disorders, anxiety and depression, and physical diseases. And what I'll be showing you is the number of people who have no mental disorder, who have a physical disease in the population, and then the number of people who have anxiety, depression with a physical disease. And you can see there from the national survey that overall, people with anxiety and depression are much more likely to have a physical condition of some type. And in terms of some of the risk factors, they're also much more likely to have a lot of the risks for mental disorders. So none of this is likely to be a great surprise to you, but setting the scene that essentially anxiety and depression go together with physical disease, and that you're much more likely to have combinations of these. So why is this important? So this is some data here which is looking at the impact of emotional disorders on disease. And this is actually a large survey where essentially what the reviewers, this is a review of a large number of studies in the literature, and essentially the reviewers concluded that the relationship between presenting physical symptoms, somatic symptoms, is much stronger with the level of emotional disorders that people have than with objective markers of disease. So what these guys did is they reviewed a large number of studies, 31 studies, 17,000 patients, and overall across the literature they showed that a comorbidity, a combination between a medical disease and an emotional disorder, those people reported higher levels of medical symptoms given the same level of objective markers of physical disease. So anxiety and depression cause people to report much more physical symptoms to you. They also showed that if you treat the emotional disorder without touching the physical disease, you get reductions in reports of the physical symptoms. So showing that it's a causal relationship. So having an emotional disorder causes people to come along to doctors and report a lot more physical disease and symptoms. Okay, these data are looking at the importance. So I want to point out the importance of having comorbid physical and emotional disorders. So this is looking at the work-related impact. And this is from a large study in the Netherlands, the big NESDA study, which is a longitudinal survey looking at anxiety and depression across life. And in these data, they're looking at the impact on both absenteeism and also work impairment caused by physical disease and anxiety and depression. And so what I'll show you is the comparison between the impact of physical disease on these issues. So there's the first bit. So we all know that if you have a physical disease, you're more likely to have impaired work. And so these data are showing that it's surprisingly low impact. So if you have physical disease across the board, the impact on work is about just under 2 times the likelihood of missing work, of being absent, compared to people without disease, and about 3.5 to 4 times the impact of having work impairment. If we then look at people who have a physical disease plus anxiety and depression, the impact is dramatically higher. So that jumps up dramatically, where the impact of having on work of having physical disease plus anxiety and depression is more in the realm of 10 to 15 times those people who have no physical disease. So having that combination has a much bigger impact on life than either one of those alone. How might that work? There are a number of different impacts of emotional disorders on physical disease that I think are likely to be important. First of all, there's likely to be a direct physical effect. That is, emotional disorders have produce a number of physical changes, neurochemical changes, heart rate changes, various other metabolic changes, etc. And all of those are likely to have a direct impact on the physical disease and contribute and compound that physical disease at a physical level. There's also likely to be a cognitive process going on. We know that people with anxiety and depression tend to have biases in the ways in which they view the world. They tend to have a biased focus of attention, biases in interpretations and biased memory processes, and all of those are likely to report on not only the reporting but the experience of physical disease. So people with anxiety and depression will focus much more attention on their physical symptoms. They will interpret benign symptoms in negative ways, and they'll selectively recall physical symptoms much more than people without anxiety and depression. And finally, there's a behavioural impact where we know that anxiety and depression will reduce the adherence to medical instructions relative to people who don't have anxiety and depression. So people who are anxious and depressed don't focus as much. They won't listen to what you say to them. They don't tend to engage in protective factors nearly as well, and they don't adhere to medication regimes as well as people without anxiety and depression. So anxiety and depression will have a direct physical impact on disease. It will have processing and interpretation impacts, and it will also have behavioural impacts to magnify and intensify disease. So hopefully I've convinced you that anxiety and depression play an important part in physical disease. So let's flip that around and say, well, how well do anxiety and depression get picked up by medical practitioners? And I'm not pointing any fingers here, just because I'm not a medical practitioner. So these are data from a very large survey in the US, looking at medical records and medical databases of, I think, around about 20,000 people. Sorry, a 250,000. So this is a survey of medical database looking at 250,000 physician presentations. And they looked for what these people did was they searched for any indication in the records or in any of the medical information, any indication that the medical practitioner picked up in any way anxiety and depression. So any mention at all of anxiety and depression. So I'll start by reminding you of the data you've already seen. So this is the national survey, the Australian National Survey. Remember, around about 5 to 15% of the population have an anxiety or mood disorder. We looked then at the primary care data that I showed you earlier from Spain, showing that sort of somewhere around 30–40% of the population presenting to primary care have a diagnosable anxiety or mood disorder. And so now I'll show you the number of times that an anxiety or mood problem of any type was mentioned in the medical records of these various medical practices. It's not a great deal. So I'd be guessing, so whereas there's no control group, of course, in this, so you've got to take this on faith, but I'd be thinking that, for example, obstetrics gynecology, the chance that only around about 0.5% of presentations involve anxiety and depression is probably an underestimate. So I think it's being missed. So why is it important? Summarising, why is it important to recognise emotional disorders amongst patients? First of all, anxiety and depression create a major source of distress in their own right, and they are responsible for reporting of physical symptoms. And therefore, by recognising anxiety and depression in your patients, you are dealing with a major source of life impairment as well as reporting of their physical disease and symptoms. And so that's the point, again, about life impairment. You're also identifying a number of fairly critical barriers to treatment. As we said, people with anxiety and depression don't adhere as much to treatment. They don't engage in lifestyle protective factors as well. So by identifying anxiety and depression, you are helping to identify a major barrier to your treatment of your physical disease. And finally, you can identify then a potentially modifiable target for treatment. Anxiety and depression are treatable, and so by identifying anxiety and depression, these things can be treated, and in turn, by treating those, you will have a much better outcome with the physical disease. So I'll finish off with that bit of information, that we know that we can treat anxiety and depression, and we can treat it reasonably well. Treatment with a good course of SSRIs or CBT treatment will result in full remission of a diagnosed disorder in anywhere from 40 to 70% of patients right across the lifespan, which in turn then will impact on physical disease. So hopefully that's convinced you that we need to pay a little bit more attention to at least one aspect of emotional distress, a mental disorder. And if you are in Sydney and want to provide any referrals for any of your patients, this is where I'm from, and feel free. Thanks.